So questions, guys?
So how wide is the gap between the, you know, there was a report in the IPFM now 2008 when I was at Princeton, a good report on really looking at naval reactors. Do you have a sense what is really the, how wide is the gap between French reactors, say, and US reactors, not reactors, submarines in terms of requirements, performance, maneuverability, and all that stuff? Is it that dramatic?
I don't know. I mean, it's a good question to ask. Yeah. I don't know, George, you have thoughts on it?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I would address it that way, Prince. I'd say the French attack boats are significantly smaller. Their reactor power is about a half of what the U.S. reactor power is. I don't know in terms of operational depths and that sort of thing, but they operate primarily in the mid and off Africa. They don't transit long distances. They don't do that sort of thing, and they have probably a lower. When you look at submarine reactors as opposed to power reactors, if you look at Diablo Canyon, it runs 24/7. You can figure out when the refuelings have to be. When you look at naval submarines, you kind of have to figure out what's the average full power operation days per year, and it can vary all over. And the French probably have lower full power operation days per year, so they can stretch out their refuelings more. And this refueling issue is a big deal for, up to this point, the way the U.S. has done refueling is to cut open the pressure hull, which is kind of a big deal, and everybody kind of freaks out because a cut open hull has got to be less strong than one that wasn't cut open,
maybe
but that's actually false.
Right.
But, we certainly, there's a lot of things. We know the French use refueling hatches, and that may limit their depth a little bit, but it also allows them to refuel much more rapidly. They just pop the hatch off and pull the reactor core out and put a new core in. And we're doing totally different things. With their aircraft carrier, they're the only ones who run an aircraft carrier nuclear powered besides the U.S., and they run LEU. Refueling a nuclear powered surface ship is easier than refueling a nuclear powered submarine because you don't have pressure hull and that sort of thing you have to cut. Nuclear powered cruiser that I was on, we had essentially not a refueling hatch because we didn't have a hatch, but we had a structure that allowed you to dive down into the reactor and pull the guts out of the reactor with minimal cutting of any hull or structure. You didn't cut the hull, you cut structure, superstructure to get down.
But you're limiting your depth if you have a hatch.
You trade off, not necessarily, there's no necessity that has to be true. But when you think about it, the hatch seals, but you have to have a support structure. So the support structure adds weight. And how much you're going to trade off weight, which then you have to have added buoyancy, and you have to have a number of things. There's a whole bunch of trade-offs. But, if you look at both the 1995 and the 2014 U.S. reports, neither one of them say anything about the French. And neither one say anything about the Chinese in terms of people who use LEU-powered submarines. And they don't even admit that we used LEU-powered submarines to start with. I have a concern, which I've talked to Charles about before, that I'm not sure that we really know that these 33-year fuel systems for the Virginia class are really going to work because nobody's run a reactor that long. So you're projecting, and the only way they could do the projection is probably to do accelerated testing. And in other fields, primary example being aircraft, accelerated testing hasn't proven all that good in determining how well the material properties work. Just because you expose the reactor core or reactor fuel rods to, let's say, 150% of the neutron flux that they're going to see over their 33-year life, doesn't mean that the fuel elements are going to perform that way when they're actually spaced out for 33 years. And it's not going to lead to a big reactor safety problem in the sense that you're going to have a meltdown of the reactor, but it's sure going to be a heck of an economic problem if at the 25-year point these fuel rods start to leak. It's kind of historically, as Charles pointed out, the Navy has been very conservative about the Navy submarine program, making very few changes. They literally got burned with the Seawolf, the second nuclear submarine because it was a sodium-cooled reactor and they had a sodium fire. And Rickover said, never again rip out the sodium cooling system. They put in a water cooling system and cooling and moderating system. And they were very, very conservative. This idea of the life of ship cores came about when they really started getting a real budgetary squeeze. And you can make arguments that it's a cheaper way of going, but maybe cheaper but less conservative. And nobody knows what the Navy did. If you look at the 1995 report, in the 1995 report, they had concerns about materials property for life of ship cores. And apparently those went away. Somebody convinced themselves that that was something that they could do. Now, how convincing that was, don't know.
Yeah, one of the recommendations you and your team point out in your report a few times, I totally agree with it, is that we do need an outside body, an independent body. It could be National Academy of Sciences, it could be the Jason group that has acts that can do classified studies that the Navy, Office of Naval Reactors can share information with them to do a peer review and look at these issues that George is talking about and see if they're limiting or not.
By the way, I'll give you one plug. It just came out yesterday, the May-June issue of Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. There's an article I wrote called something about using LEU. Can LEU be used for naval propulsion reactors? - don't ask the U.S. Navy.
All right, thank you for your presentation. As the questions were going on in my head, you had answered them right there. So,
Thanks. Yeah.
So thank you for that. But you had mentioned, so in my mind, two things are important when it comes to new technologies for the military: cost and performance. Obviously, you mentioned those. So and you also had mentioned that HEU reactors are much quieter than LEU reactors.
Right.
Can you, just from my own knowledge, can you outline a little bit about why, and also if you think that the technology is there to make LEU reactors as quiet as HEU reactors, or is that not possible?
Well, I think it's a great question, and George, welcome to chime in. I think one reason, I'm probably not aware of all the reasons. One big reason, I think I may have mentioned it, is that you look at coolant flow, and these are pressurized water reactors. And the light water reactors in the United States are of two types: pressurized water reactors, boiling water reactors. Roughly 2/3 of our commercial reactors are pressurized water reactors. They're basically a much bigger, scaled up version of a naval propulsion system. And no coincidence there, because Westinghouse and General Electric were two companies that were intimately involved in working with the Navy, developing designs. And there's been a back and forth between the nuclear Navy engineers and personnel and the commercial nuclear sector as well. So this is by way of saying that the way these I should have had a diagram of pressurized water reactor setup, but you have a primary coolant loop where the water goes through the reactor core, and you have what are called main coolant pumps. These very powerful pumps circulate that water, and there's a pressurizer to keep the water liquid, and so then that's the primary loop, and then that superheated water is then under high pressure is then directed into a steam generator. You have all these U-tubes, very strong, thin U-tubes, transferring that heat to a secondary water system. And that secondary water system, the water is allowed to turn into steam, high pressure steam, hit turbines and generate electricity. That's the basic system. But you have water moving around rapidly that keep the core cool, and so that moving water makes noise. And with the HEU cores, because it's designed, you don't have as much of the coolant flow or coolant or water noise as you would have in what they would imagine an LEU system that would basically have the same type of design as the HEU system, same type of layout. Now, I did flash that slide about what about designs are more compact and integrated, like this smart small modular reactor design. And so I think that kind of design might solve this noise problem. where you might actually have even quieter LEU fueled or non-HEU type of systems, because you have everything within that vessel. And you could have, imagine, noise isolating systems, dampers, and et cetera, to make these even quieter than the current HU design systems. Anything you want to add? Yeah.
Well, one thing, it's in the Virginia Tech publication that's part of the study, and it's on the FAS website. It's not just noise. When you're using the LEU core, there are certain reactor parameters that operate differently, particularly when you change fuel temperature. The LEU core, because it has a high percentage of uranium-238, it responds differently to power changes. Primarily, as neutrons need to be moderated and slowed down in the reactor, they go through a region of energy which captures neutrons, and these are called resonance capture areas. And what happens, and they're more predominant in the U-238 than they are in the 235. So when you have LEU, you've got like 20 times as much 238 as you have in the HEU cores, 10 times, whatever it is. And those Doppler broaden with temperature. So you have to change rod position when you're, rather than just the HEU core kind of self-moderates, it has a feedback loop. But moderation is not a good term, because that we have a feedback loop that's built into the HEU core just as a function of nature, which makes it a lot easier to control the reactor. So there are a lot of subtle issues about these things, but the basic thing is the size of the reactor core, the fuel density, and having to have more pumps to circulate more water. It's the pumps as much as the actual water rush. The water rush is not as much as the harmonics that come from the pumps. If you look at submarines go through a lot of things to do sound isolation with the hull, because the hull couples right to the seawater, and isolating the pumps and the pump frequencies is one of the big problems. You had a question you wanted to ask about PALs, so it's a good time.
I did. Oh, sure. This is very off topic, but unless anybody has any more questions that go on.
I have
on top.
one, but one, no, go ahead, do yours. I can grab Charles at another point if we run out of time. Don't worry.
On U.S. submarines, I've read some literature, a non-class domain, that talks about how PALs may or may not be taken off once they're on the actual submarine, and they may be authorization codes or something like that, that are physically protecting the device on a submarine. Can you elaborate on that at all? If what the extent of PALs when they're actually physically on the submarine look like? If there's any unclassed information on that?
Yeah, I think that could be a case where I'm searching the compartments and sweeping the cobwebs in my mind. But I'm somewhat familiar with this system because I did go through this training program about, at least in a ballistic missile submarine I was on, was not a Trident missile carrying boat, but it was Poseidon missile carrying boat. So it was an older system. And they were in the process of moving toward type of PALs or permissive action links that one would have in the Air Force, the ICBMs or the cruise missiles. Because you're alluding to one of the criticisms of the naval system of nuclear weapons is that didn't have adequate security over the warheads. And I think the view from the Navy was, well, we have a personnel reliability program. We go through this process. We vet the personnel, and they have psychological screening. And there's at least a 2-person rule. You don't have someone just alone with a nuclear warhead. To get access to it, you have to have 2 people turn keys simultaneously, et cetera, et cetera. Nonetheless, there were still possible breaches that could happen in that security system, and that's basically the extent that I know of it. I don't know, and then I got out long before they really implemented the new system. So so I'm not trying to be coy and hide something from you, but trying to think who could.
When
address
Tom
that.
Gray comes back from the IAEA, ask Tom.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think it's funny you're telling this story because we're talking about that my dad was in the Naval Academy as well, and he has a somewhat frightening story about the two key system.
Oh, no.
I won't share offline.
Yeah. Right.
His experience.
Yeah, we'll have to put the cone of silence.
quick summary.
Yeah.
But also having his experience and hearing him talk over the dinner table about the R&D timeline, it's great that you're able to find that gap at this point. I totally agree that Scramble was a sweet spot of being able to have this discussion right now because, I've heard this for decades with my father about how that timeline works and getting this type of discussion going now if you're talking about looking at the next generation. And I really like the idea of to bring in more diesel. I think that's something that would be interesting to see how that might impact some of this. I also was wondering whether if you focus more on the carriers and the not the submarines, but the above water type of ships first and focus more attention on that, does that maybe start changing the discussion? Because it seems that it's a little bit less complicated system.
Yeah, their report, George's report with his
Yeah.
graduates, they point that out too. And then also something I was reading just really a few days ago when I was in the final phases of putting this talk together, I found that RAND did a study for the Navy, this is about 12 years ago or so, looking at options for the Ford class aircraft carrier.
Okay.
And they said, look, there's trade-offs, and you could go to life of ship core, or you could do one refueling, and here's the cost-benefit analysis. And the Navy's made a decision. They want all these advanced systems, some things I talked about. So that drove them toward a midlife refueling.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't have the pressure hull considerations on an aircraft carrier. You have more volume, space to deal with within the reactor compartment. In theory, I think. Yeah. And I don't know how they've designed it, because I don't have access to that. But one would think that they would have some more leeway, some parameters they can work with.
Yeah, the Navy, basically, if you look at their reports, even going back to 1995, they say, we could build LEU cores. The problem is we can't fit the LEU cores with the fuel density we have now into the current attack submarine frame. We might be able to squeeze them into the SSBN frames. We probably have to do some modification. Not as big a problem for the ballistic missile boats. Also, not as big a problem for the carriers, but they all say, well, we'd have to lengthen the carriers a little bit and this and that. So there's a lot of cost. But the big cost factor is in the refuelings. Because when you think about it, there are two aspects to the refueling. It's not just that you have to refuel the reactor, but if you want to keep, let's say, 20 submarines at sea, and you have 20 submarines that have life of ship cores, and you compare those with how many submarines you have to have if you're doing refuelings, you wind up with you have to buy 24 submarines, plus you have to buy all these extra cores.
Right.
So there's a big difference cost-wise. One of the real criticisms of the 2014 report is they were asked to update the cost studies, and they did absolutely nothing about updating the cost studies.
Yeah.
To what extent in your report have you looked at high-performance reactors and learned from how they're using, uranium, molybdenum fuels and things like this? And success they're having.
That's a great question. I think that's something that my hope was that we would have a few members of our team do some work on that, given our limited resources, et cetera. But it just didn't happen. I won't, get into details publicly why. But so that was, frankly, I was a little disappointed. But I think it's ripe for follow-on study. And some congressional staff I talked to raised this issue as well, and looking at some experience with some of the challenges also with converting the research reactors. And, I was at Oak Ridge last year, saw Hyper. Yeah, exactly. And it's a beautiful, I don't know if you've ever seen the design, it's beautiful. It's like handcrafted. And it's amazing. I've not even been an engineer, and it's just a beautiful, it's like almost a sculpture. and you put it in the museum, but this is something that's designed for the special purpose, and they keep running into roadblocks and trying to shift it to LEU, and they're trying, but I think something might be interesting is to do. May I talk to you later about this? Case studies you could do, and bring you in part of the next phase of the work, and lessons learned from these other reactor conversions.
Hey, thanks a lot for the talk. My question is about recommendation number 5 about the IAEA safeguards. And so Russia also has civilian naval reactors. There's a handful of icebreakers and 1 cargo ship. I was wondering if there was any lessons from that could be learned.
Yeah,
They shifted from LEU to HEU.
Yeah.
And now they're looking at maybe again going to LEU. There's a new icebreaker reactor that they've been looking at, which is the same thing they're using, or same model that they're using for their floating power reactor.
Yes.
So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean they have some interest in the whole thing, but a couple of years ago in Vienna there was the second of these HEU minimization conferences, primarily focusing on the naval propulsion reactors, but considering other things. And I think it was Texas. I can't. So you guys in your study?
Cooperman. Yeah.
Cooperman made a proposal to the Russian Federation person who was on the panel and said, Russia could take the lead in showing the world that we could use LEU for naval for submarine fuel. And this guy said, yeah, and then we'd have crummy submarines.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of resistance to that.
Right. But I mean, in terms of how safeguards are applied to their civilian ships, if at all.
They do not. There's no safeguards. Of course, they're a weapon state, so we don't. It's not.
They could do voluntary ones. But
they could do voluntary, but they haven't.
Yeah.
Like we haven't. We don't have
Right.
safeguards at the Locania.
Yeah.
Right. But there's been no studies about how maybe one of the things you talked about with number 5 was some confidence building measures, and I was wondering if that was one of the case studies looked at.
I believe there's some reluctance at the IAEA. Tom Gray, one of the students here, is at the IAEA, and he was one of the people who worked on the paper that we wrote. And he wanted to do that at the IAEA, and he sent me an email and said, they don't want to touch this. The implication was they were getting pressure from the U.S. not to mess with this.
Thank you.
What's it called? Was it INSAG or was it SAGSI or something? There was a
SAGSI?
Yeah, because I was told by an allied government official that he was aware, and he hasn't seen it, but he's aware that several years ago there was a SAGSI report for the IAEA looking at this issue of safeguards in naval reactors, and it was of a view to maybe eventually bring it before the Board of Governors. But I agree with George.
It's politically sensitive.
It is.
But are you going to the safeguards course this?
I
I was going to say, ask at the safeguard course, because Jill Cooley, who was the coordinator for SAGSI, is going to be at the course. Any other questions? Yes. I don't know what we're going to do with all the pizza.
Oh, definitely.
I saw it. It's like a lot to eat back there. Yeah.